Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. IHC Director Susan Derwin is out sick and unfortunately can't make it here today. My name is Chris Boberg. I'm the Associate Director here at the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center, and I will be doing my best to fill some big shoes this afternoon. The IHC Faculty Fellowship Award is one of the most valuable awards that the IHC administers because it gives faculty time to concentrate on their research and creative projects. Those who receive the award are designated IHC Fellows, and they are released from teaching for 1 quarter. Each year, the IHC Advisory Board reads the dozens and dozens of applications we get for this award. I am lucky enough to assist in their review and to get an overview of the remarkable work our faculty in the humanities, arts, and humanistic social sciences are doing. I'm always energized by the board's discussions and proud that the IHC can play a role in helping bring their innovative research to fruition. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located. And I would also like to pay respect to elders, past and present, as well as other Indigenous people present today. Finally, please keep an eye out for an announcement in the very near future about the IHC's public event series for the upcoming academic year. We hope you will join us. Okay, now it is my pleasure to introduce this year's IHC Faculty Fellows. Each of them will speak about their work for 20 minutes, and then we will open up the floor to the audience for questions and comments. Our first presenter is Stephanie Malia Hwang, Professor of Transnational Italian Studies. She writes and lectures on modern Italy and the Mediterranean, mobility studies, colonialism and imperialism, migration and detention, and tourism history and practice. She is the author of Empire's Mobius Strip, Historical Echoes in Italy's Crisis of Migration and Detention, which won the 2019 AAIS Book Prize, and The Beautiful Country, Tourism in the Impossible State of Destination Italy. She also co-edited with Ruth Ben-Ghiat, Italian Mobilities, and with Claudio Fogu and Lauren E. Ruberto, the special issue of Californian Italian Studies on Borderless Italy. She is co-editor with Dan Arenga of the forthcoming volume, Crime, Italian Style, Illegality, and the Making of Italy. She has been awarded numerous fellowships, including from the American Council of Learned Societies, American Academy in Rome, and the Stanford Humanities Center. Today, we will hear about one of her 2 current book projects on redemption, slavery and colonialism in Italy. Please join me in welcoming Professor Stephanie Malia Hwang.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Chris, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to all of you for coming out on this beautiful afternoon. I would like to start by thanking the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center, Director Susan Derwin, Associate Director Chris Boberg, as well as the entire staff and team and advisory board for giving me the honor and privilege of being an IHC Fellow, a faculty fellow this year. I'd also like to thank my colleagues in the Department of French and Italian and the Italian program who are here today for allowing me to take this teaching release and for supporting me in my research. So my presentation today, I'm going to give you a broad overview of the genesis and stakes of my current book project and the archival materials that I've been sifting through and unpacking as I seek to understand the relationship between slavery and colonialism in the context of Italy. It's very much a work in progress, so I welcome your comments, your questions, and your feedback. So a little bit of intellectual background. I'm an Italianist with disciplinary training in literary criticism, history, and cultural anthropology. And during the COVID lockdown, I was working on an article about Italian colonial fiction and the rhetorical mechanisms that underpinned the myth that Italy is colorblind and also anti-Black racism in Italy today. The idea that Italy is colorblind or that Italy is not racist is tied to the history of Italian colonialism, which, unlike that of France and Britain, has been largely disavowed or not remembered in Italy. Despite the fact that Italy held colonies and possessions for almost 50 years, its colonial project lasted from 1890 to 1943 and was amongst the most brutal and bloody enterprises of modern European imperialism. If it is acknowledged at all, it's framed as something of a colonialism light, or it's framed within the context of this myth of Italians as good colonizers, or Italiani brava gente. But like France and Britain, Italian colonizers commonly used the trope of the civilizing mission to justify the violence of colonial occupation. Anyone who studies empire and colonialism will recognize the civilizing mission. And as I was working on this article, I was reading through Cedric Robinson's seminal work on Black Marxism, and I kept returning to the observations that he made about the Italian city of Genoa, and specifically that Genoese merchant capitalists ensconced themselves into the entire structure of Portuguese power. It was in this way Italian capitalists situated themselves to play a critical role in determining the pace, the character, and the structure of the early transatlantic slave trade of the next century. Now, Robinson was citing Charles Verlinden, the renowned medievalist and historian of slavery in Europe, who likewise argued that Italians, and specifically Genoese and Venetians, were the linchpins linking slavery in the medieval and early modern Mediterranean to the transatlantic slave trade. Verlinden writes, if one considers the uninterrupted succession from medieval slavery in Europe to the colonial slavery of the Italian possessions in the Levant and the Atlantic islands of the two Iberian states, then slavery in America was only an adaptation to the new milieu. Verlinden was writing in the mid-20th century, and today there's much more scholarship unpacking the ties between Mediterranean slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. And what this scholarship has made clear is just how interconnected these Mediterranean and Atlantic worlds really were. So acknowledging these interconnected dynamics, my project zeroes in on the relationship between slavery in the Mediterranean in the 18th and 19th centuries and European colonial imperialism, specifically Italian imperialism, Italian colonialism, in the 19th and 20th. Conventional wisdom in Italy holds that there are no links. In fact, an archivist in Genoa once told me point blank, oh, there's nothing there. No, there's no link at all. She said to me, of course you can draw links between Mediterranean slavery and contemporary human trafficking, but there's absolutely no connection between slavery and Italian colonialism. One second. So I wondered, how is that possible? Slavery, like colonialism, has a long transnational history in Italy, one that has likewise been disavowed, but remains present in everyday life. When we say the word ciao in greetings, for example, this is the etymology. It comes from the Italian word schiavo, meaning slave, through the Venetian dialect of ciao, it was used as a greeting, as a slave I bow down to you, to the word ciao. So every time we say the word ciao, we're activating this history that has been disavowed. And of course, in Italy, we have multiple experiences and histories of slavery, from the Roman Empire to the medieval Mediterranean, that's the Black Sea trade in the Levant, the Barbary Coast, and then to the transatlantic. I would like to note that the terms slavery and colonialism mean different things in different contexts, and I'm very aware of the gradated degrees and types of slavery. The ways that I'm using the terms here are drawn from the archival documents themselves. So for example, Genoese citizens who were captured and enslaved most often referred to themselves as slaves, schiavi, and the state of captivity was termed schiavitù, slavery. In other contexts, they were called captives, captivi, and sometimes the two were used interchangeably to describe a prisoner's state of captivity and bondage, captive and slave. So with the support of an academic Senate faculty research grant from UCSB, as well as a Bogliasco Foundation fellowship and a Barbieri grant in modern Italian history, last year I had the opportunity to conduct extensive archival research in Genoa and in Liguria. And here's a slide here. I started out with the intention in this project of focusing on Genoa and Venice, but I realized quickly the material was too much. It became overwhelming. So I decided to focus my attention on Genoa for several reasons. One, Venice as a case has been relatively well studied, and Genoa, the archival sources are only becoming accessible now. And it's a relatively understudied case, even though I think it is very important. And if you're not familiar with Genoa, as a city and a republic, it built its wealth on maritime trade. everything about this region, about Liguria, is centered on the sea. And you can see here's a map of the Republic of Genoa's trade routes from the 13th through 17th centuries. They extended as far east as the Black Sea and as far west as the Azores and everywhere in between. Its celebrated hometown hero, Christopher Columbus, is still remembered proudly by the city's inhabitants, and its wealth is still visible in the opulent palaces in the city's center and surrounds. In Genoa, I was commonly cited a statistic that at the apex of its maritime empire, 2 out of 3 Genovese citizens were out at sea. So 2/3 of the population were engaged in this maritime trade. And because of their close ties to the sea, Genoese citizens were at high risk of being captured and enslaved, most notably during the era of Barbary piracy between 1500 and 1800. It's hard to know exact figures, but historian Giacomo Ghidini notes that at its height, the experience was so common that every Genoese citizen would have likely had a family member or friend been taken captive. Such was the fear. The fear was so pervasive that watchtowers like this one, this is Torre Gropallo in Nervi, south of Genoa, were installed along the coastline, and you'll see them everywhere in the region. The city's Maritime Museum also offers a visceral reminder of the fate that awaited many of those who were enslaved, which was imprisonment and work on a galley. While redemption itself has been linked to slavery for millennia, and redemption at its basis is the purchase of one's freedom, buying one's freedom, what is unique in Genoa is that an entire proto-state apparatus, the Magistrate for Slave Redemption, the Magistrato per Riscatto dei Schiavi, was created to raise money and negotiate the release of its enslaved citizens who were imprisoned in slave prisons along the Barbary coast. This was the only purely state-sponsored institution dedicated to slave redemption. There were others. Most were run by the church, but some were partnerships between church and state. You could see here 2 of the most famous would be the Trinitarians and the Mercedarians in France and Spain, respectively, but also founded around the same time as the Magistrate in Genoa were similar organizations in Venice, Naples, Palermo, and there were other cities as well. But redemption, according to historian Robert Davis, was not really successful. He estimates only about 5% of cases of slaves were ever redeemed and brought home through all of these efforts. But kidnapping and ransom were big business, especially in Genoa. So while I was in Genoa, I learned about this archival file, this archival fondo, for the Magistrate for Slave Redemption, which is an archival fondo that's completely uncatalogued and unorganized. The archivist even told me they don't really know what's in it. What they do know is that when the archive was bombed in World War II, there used to be 245 units, now there are only 61. Fewer than half a dozen scholars have ever looked at this material, and I am happy to be very fortunate to be in touch with 3 of those people. So it's good to compare notes. So as I was going through these documents, the story that emerged from this was a fascinating one. At its founding in 1595, almost 100 years after the Genoese financed the voyages of Columbus under the protection of Ferdinand and Isabel, and as Genoese merchant capitalists were embedding themselves into the structures of Portuguese power, closer to home, the Genoese realized that redemption was a new profit-making industry. In a sense, it helped Genoa diversify its investment portfolio. So what I found, for example, I found meticulously kept lists of Genoese citizens who had been taken into captivity. This is a letter from a ship captain demanding payment for delivery of slaves. I found letters like this one from Giacomo Chiasso from the town of Spoturno. He was a slave who had been imprisoned in Algiers, who was writing to the magistrate to send money to get him out of the prison. Here, he's asking for 300 Spanish pieces of 8. I found deeds establishing the redemption price of individual slaves. Here we have one for this man named Filippo Carbone, who was the son of Giovanni Battista of a town called Sestri di Ponte. He was a slave in Algiers. His ransom price was 1,390 lire. Most interestingly, I found many of these financial reports, and they had lists of borrowers and creditors, debitori, creditori. And what I discovered was that under cover of redemption, the magistrato wasn't using the money to actually redeem slaves, but instead gathering the money, getting capital, and making high-interest loans out to other Genoese in the city. So under the cover of redemption, the magistrato became a credit lending agency on par with its famous Bank of St. George. This should come as no surprise, because as Fernand Braudel reminds us, it was the Genoese who pioneered the instruments of modern finance. In short, redemption was a quick way to raise capital under the cover of a noble cause, capital that could be put to work in the short term, making high-interest loans. And what the magistrato documents revealed was a complex economic system at work that generated vast sums of capital in the name of redemption. So much so that when the magistrato closed in 1823, so it was in existence for the better part of almost 300 years, it closed in 1823. I went through the liquidation documents, which are stored in an archive in Rome. Its true function was made clear, and here it says, it cannot be said that this establishment aids the poor in general, not with money, neither in illness nor in health. This institution is a true lending agency. So was this it? Was this the end of redemption? What remains of this large-scale trans-Mediterranean redemption operation? What are its physical, cultural, and moral ripple effects? In what ways did redemption change? And how did profits continue to be made off the coerced movements of people? I found these answers, in part, in another archive. And that was the archive of the Capuchin friars, the Frati Minori Cappuccini, also in Genoa. Contrary to the archivist's assertion that there is no link between slavery and colonialism, I believe that they are closer and more entwined than we would acknowledge. My hypothesis is that large-scale large-scale operations of slave ransom and redemption, like those of the magistrato, served as an important yet unacknowledged ideological precedent for the civilizing mission of Italy's colonial enterprise. In short, operations of redemption to rescue slaves and to civilize natives connected slavery and colonialism in the context of Italy. So here we have the story of Genovese friar Don Niccolò Oliveri. He was a Capuchin friar, and he founded a new organization in 1841, which was the Opera per Riscatto delle Fanciulle More. And you can see the direct resonance with the magistrato. He's using the same terms, riscatto, ransom, right? So this is the organization for the redemption of young black girls. Oliveri had done missionary work in Egypt, and he was horrified by the slave markets he saw there, a terminus of what was known as the Indian Ocean slave trade. He believed it was his calling to release the young girls, to rescue them from these markets. And he penned missives denouncing slavery in Eastern Africa and the existing slave markets. And what I found in the archive was that Oliveri basically took the system that had been in place for the magistrato and just appropriated it for himself for this new organization. He was collecting donations in order to rescue these young girls. Oliveri's organization was not the only one of its sort. There was others in France and one in Verona that I could follow, but he was by far the largest and arguably the most successful. He managed to rescue more than 2,000 girls during the existence of this organization, which may be more than the magistrato rescued during its entire 300-year history. So in the archive, I found donation solicitation letters. Here's a receipt for the purchase of 2 slave girls in Alexandria. This is his report to donors about the girls redeemed from slavery. And unlike the magistrato, many of the archival documents were dedicated to the progress of the girls who were redeemed and their life in Europe. Whether or not these girls actually asked to be taken to Europe is another question. These girls had been baptized, they were sent to live with nuns, they were converted, and they were trained to be missionaries who would then return to Africa and convert the local population. That's, in other words, these documents followed the ways these girls had become civilized, and Oliveri used this fact of civilization to raise money. Put another way, Oliveri's was an operation of redemption and civilizing mission rolled into one, the link between slavery and colonialism, and it presaged the work of Italian explorers in Eastern Africa just a few years later. So this is the final part. Oh, this is a letter, 2 letters from 2 of the girls who had been redeemed by Oliveri. So this, by the late 1860s and early 1870s, just a few years after Oliveri's organization closed down, Italian explorers used the interruption of the slave trade in East Africa as one of the reasons to explore and occupy the territory. Now, this is the part of the book that is least developed so far, and I need to go back here in Rome to the archives of the Italian Geographic Society to look through more of the correspondence and documents around these early Italian explorations in Eastern Africa. But what I did find, particularly, I spent 1 day at this archive, I did find letters from the expedition of Romolo Gessi specifically saying that we need to establish a presence here, so that an Italian presence in what he was calling Somalia at the time, to interrupt the Eastern slave trade. So this is the basic trajectory. I would say also that these Italian expeditions mapped the topography, documented climate, recorded flora and fauna, and they provided sort of the base information for Italian colonizers to go in just a few years later. You recall that in 1884-85, the Berlin Conference partitions Africa amongst European powers, and in 1890, Italy declares Eritrea its firstborn colony. And from there, the colonial civilizing mission gets kicked off into high gear. So I will, and with that, thank you very much. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Our next presenter is Susan Hwang, Assistant Professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultural Studies. Her teaching and research focus on cultures of protest in modern Korea, the intellectual history of East Asia, the relationship between aesthetics and politics, theories of world literature, and translation. She has published essays, translations, and reviews in such venues as the Journal of Korean Studies, Azalea, Journal of Korean Literature and Culture, and the Routledge Handbook of Modern Korean Literature. Before coming to UCSB, she taught in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at Indiana University. Today, we will hear about her current book project, Uncaged Songs, Culture and Politics of Protest Music in South Korea. Please join me in welcoming Professor Susan Hwang.
Wow, good afternoon. Thank you, Chris, for that warm introduction. And huge thanks, of course, goes to the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center for this wonderful fellowship. And it really, as Stephanie said, truly made a meaningful difference for me as well, especially in terms of what I was able to do to work towards the completion of this current book manuscript in the given year. So my book project is titled Uncaged Songs, Culture and Politics of Protest Music in South Korea. This title is actually inspired by this very famous quote from Harry Belafonte, "You can cage the singer, but not the song," which emerged from his involvement in the U.S. civil rights movement. but has resonated so very deeply with me for the way it encapsulates the enduring power of song to really transcend means of repression, censorship, and inspire action. So Uncaged Songs examines the protest song movement, which took place in the 1970s and 80s in South Korea. Two decades during which the country underwent key processes of modernization, namely industrialization and democratization. Engaging with songs as potent affective conduits, my book narrates how the songs shaped and were shaped by two interrelated transformations that took place in the democratization movement. One, the subjectivation of youth as students vested with the moral imperative of change. And two, the shift in the character of opposition from directionless discontent to consummately organized, systematized conflict against military dictatorship. I argue in turn that the democratization movement, as illustrated by the songs, was co-determined by the repressive actions of the Park Chung-hee regime and the resistance of the dissidents. And so as persecution intensified, the protests became more frequent and more consequential. So one of the most iconic scenes in the popular memory of South Korea's democratization is the funeral procession in July 1987 of Lee Han-yeol, a student protester who died after being hit by a police tear gas canister in June of that year. The song being sung by the massive crowd throughout this procession was none other than Morning Dew, or 아침 이슬 in Korean, which came out in 1971. It was written by the most famous folk singer of Korea, Kim Min-gi. Fast forward 30-some years, the song would continue to be sung by protesters during the candlelight protests, which would lead to the impeachment of Park Geun-hye in 2017 and voila, the impeachment of Yoon Suk-yeol in 2025. Fiercely resistant to singing in public, however, the author of this very song, Kim Min-gi, once recalled that upon hearing hundreds of thousands of people singing the song in unison during this funeral procession, he realized that the song no longer belonged to him, and that when the song returned to him 100-fold, it was both deeply humbled and overwhelmed with burden. Indeed, for all that the song has come to embody as the very anthem of resistance in the 1970s and beyond, Kim Min-gi was an accidental revolutionary. As an art student at the prestigious Seoul National University, Kim Min-gi loved to strum his guitar and write songs, baptized as he were by the songs of the North American folk revival. The very song that gave him his most famed designation as the troubadour of the revolution was written within the cultural habitus of the 1970s, when he was a freshman in college, barely at the dawn of his musical career that would continue over the next 5 decades. Unbeknownst to the singer himself, Morning Dew would become the seal to his lasting reputation as an artist marrying music to social critique. It is this reputation that would make him so immensely popular among the youth of the time, and on account of such popularity, the most subversive in the eyes of the authoritarian state. So throughout his life, Kim Min-gi would resist, and sometimes not without disdain, the title of revolutionary. The song marked the turbulent beginnings of his life, but initially no one could foresee the subversiveness of the song. In 1971, not only did the song pass the pre-censorship review under Park's regime, but it actually received the City of Seoul's Culture Award, on account of its poetic lyrics and very tender, emotive melody. So I'll play a little bit of that now.
긴 방시 세우고 풀잎마다 맺힌 진주보다 더 고운 아침 이슬처럼 내 맘의 서름이 아라리 맺힐 때 아침 동산에 올라 작은 미소를 배운다. 태양 묘지 위에 붉게 떠오르고 한낮에 찌는 더위는 나의 시련일지라. 나 이제 가노라 저 거친 광야에 서러움 모두 버리고 나 이제 가노라.
So, sorry. What could explain for the state's initial endorsement of this song? One possible answer may be found when we place the song in the context of what Park Chung-hee at the time was advancing as quote-unquote Korean-style democracy or 한국적 민주주의, citing such reasons as preserving Korea's unique cultural traditions, the urgent need for rapid economic growth, and the ideological threat posed by communism from their frenemy, North Korea. Park counter-characterized his rule against the potential danger inherent in wholly embracing the tenets of American liberal democracy. The realm of popular music was one place in particular where Park attempted to enact his brand of rule. This was put into practice through censorship. Examples of banned songs may provide some clues as to how censorship really operated at the time. So I bring a couple here just to give you guys a sense of the kinds of songs that were banned from public purview. So this is the first one by the doyen of a very popular genre in Korea called trot, or it's kind of like an Asian version of foxtrot. Okay? So let's hear a little bit. Okay, any takers? Why would it be banned? No? Okay. Had to do something with the Japanese feel. So Will and Sabine might recognize the very Enka-ness of the song. And at the time, for a president like Park Chung-hee, he was trying to, sort of propound the necessity of Koreanness among the people for unity's sake, consolidation of the subjects. This actually became a little bit of a tricky situation for him. But Park Chung-hee is a very well-known, very famed fan of Imija. So then he would have these private concerts with her in the, the Blue House against his own policy to ban these kinds of foreign music. This was another number that was banned.
거짓말이야 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 사랑도 거짓말 웃음도 거짓말 거짓말이야.
Any takers? Huh? To rock? Yeah. A little bit, so Kim Chuja, the performer, artist here, she was one of the early practitioners of rock and sort of ventures a little bit into psychedelic rock later on, which you might hear more if I were to play the music, but I don't want to keep that. So inciting distrust was this, the reason cited by the state. And maybe it has something to do with the many lies in the lyrics, but who knows? Last one here. Okay.
물 좀 주소 물 좀 주소 목마르요 물 좀 주소 물은 사랑이요 나의 목을 간지며
Okay. Anybody? It was reminiscent of water torture, which was a classic form of torture used by the KCIA in the 70s and in the 80s, and would actually incur the death of one of the famed protesters in 1987. So in many ways, if you look at how censorship operated at the time, it was almost clear that it was state's knee-jerk reaction. But what's also interesting is that this kind of preemptive measures of censorship was operating in such a way that it would prompt the listeners, innocent as they were, to start thinking about the very sort of poetics of the song in this particular way, in light of the censorship. So censorship actually ended up incurring all kinds of unintended effects, as we can see in these kind of examples. Okay. So in place of residual nostalgia for Japanese music or the countercultural trends inspired by the style of hippies or sounds of psychedelic rock in the West, Park Chung-hee called for homogeneous unity of the nation in the name of security and development through implementing, in place of banned songs, a replacement of that with such uplifting numbers as this one here, the infamous Song of the New Village. New Village movement was kind of a movement began by the regime in 1972 in order to revamp the countryside. But instead of really sort of providing resources to the countryside, it ended up turning it into this kind of self-help program that did little, very little, to balance out the resources between the city and the countryside, and sort of bifurcated and sort of marginalized the countryside even further. So it's a kind of a propagandistic song, and this is what it sounds like. So within the parameters defined by what has been called the American boundaries for South Korea, a shorthand description of the US-ROK alliance, both as a bulwark against communism and a showcase of the free world, the Pak regime perpetually gave precedence to anti-communism over democracy. Under these skewed conditions, what the state sought to achieve, perhaps in its validation of Morning Dew, and the Korea-born and Korea-raised songwriter Kim Min-gi was perhaps a native and therefore potentially nationalist antidote with which to contain and counteract the Western, more radical version of liberalism as represented by the American brand of democracy implicated in the civil rights movement and anti-war activism. What the state didn't realize in the beginning, however, is that the nativist gesture that it discovers in Park Kim Min-gi's Morning Dew would carry more subversiveness than it could have imagined. By no means written as a protest song, nor embodying the acoustics of a militant march, Morning Dew would rapidly become a powerful social force of the time by virtue of the students singing the song in various venues and contexts, from new student orientations and sing-along clubs to underground activist circles and mass protests on the streets. And upon the discovery of the song's popularity, Morning Dew would be virtually stripped of its vaunted status as a healthy song and be rebranded unambiguously as Puron Gayo, impure or even seditious song. Paradoxically then, its illegalization is what would notch up its value as a protest song par excellence among the students. And as you can see, in this songbook from the university song clubs in the 1980s, the entirety of section 2 here, over here, all the way to the beginning of section 3, is actually Kim Min-gi's song. So he really becomes kind of a spiritual figure among the student dissidents. As singular and momentous as Morning Dew is, in illustrating Kim Min-gi's enduring significance, perhaps the more potent demonstration of Kim's impact as a songwriter comes through with real clarity in his other songs, such as these two here that speak of the post-war lived reality of a biracial child awaiting their mother, or the journey up to Seoul in search of a medicine for ailing parents. Lyrics that draw attention not to the heroic that remains manicured and static in time, but the mundane everyday lives of those in the peripheries of the state's vision. In this way, Kim Min-gi was perhaps taking very seriously the people-oriented qualities inherent in American folk and putting it into practice in the social climate of South Korea at the time. And perhaps it's within Kim Min-gi's songs such as these that we are able to see alternative visions of what democracy Korean style could have been. Thank you.
I have deep knowledge of the slave trade in Italy through a comic that I read as a child, which in German is called Asterix and Obelix. You're familiar with that, right? Okay, so that's my level, okay? But I wanted to ask you a much even more basic question, namely, why do you think the idea that Italy didn't have slave trade and that there wasn't racism has come about?
Sabina, for that question. So I think there are several things going on here. I think this idea of slavery, there are several types of slavery and several histories of slavery that are sometimes commingled or left unsaid. I think the history of slavery in the Roman Empire is one that is taught, right? But lesser known is the history of the slavery from the Black Sea and the Levant. There's great work that's been done on that recently. I'm thinking of Hannah Barker's work on that precious merchandise, where she looks at the Genoese colony that's established in Kaffa on the Great Sea. Right? The Venetians also had Tana. So there's, I'm talking about 11th through 13th century. And these are slaves from the Caucasus who are brought primarily into domestic servitude within Italy. So there's largely women, right, who are working in households. And this, at the same time, in this era, there are other slaves coming from, Muslim slaves coming from North Africa who are also being enslaved within Italy. So there's the dynamics of a lot of the scholarship are looking at the people who are enslaved within Italy. Last year, there was a book that came out about the slaves of the popes, right? And so some of the understanding around slavery focuses on that dynamic of the people who were enslaved in Italy and the abolition of those people. In fact, there's great work by Giulia Bonazza on the abolition and the persistence of slavery in the Italian states. And what we have are baptismal records, because a lot of these slaves who were of different religions chose to convert to Catholicism in order to free themselves, but usually it didn't work out very well. So the histories of Venetians and Genoese and Neapolitans, or people who we consider to be Italian, being enslaved in the Barbary Coast is lesser known, right? And so I chose to focus on that because of these extraordinary records that are present in Genoa and in Venice. And I think it's lesser known. Also, it has become, particularly in popular memory in Italy today, there is this idea of kind of historical disavowal. We saw this first with fascism, of not wanting to talk about it, right, after the end of the fascist regime. We're seeing this with colonialism and not wanting to acknowledge that Italy had colonies and possessions. It's framed in this idea of Italiani brava gente, Italy as being good colonizers. And I wanted to, when I approached this project, it was about going back one further layer of this dynamics of power in which, I started from the premise that the control of movement over people was the kind of the driving force of empire. This is my 19th, 20th century, imperialist approach or imperialist framework that I was working with, and I wanted to see where that idea of mobility or coerced immobility, how we could go back to. There's another whole precedent, unacknowledged precedent, which I saw as being this history of slavery. So hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you all for your talks. But I have a question for Susan. When I listened to the songs you played, one of them sounds really familiar to me, the New Village song, deemed by the government healthy, right? It reminds me of some songs from North Korea, also the revolutionary songs I heard from China. So I was wondering if they share some common source of influence or something. So I would like you to get your opinion.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I absolutely agree. And every time I play this song in my Cultures of Protest class, my students are very surprised. They're like, that's from South Korea? The land of K-pop? The land of BTS and Blackpink and voila, in 1970s. I think what's interesting about these so-called healthy songs is the way in which the state, much like the Chinese state under Mao and under the Kim family in North Korea, they recognize the importance of music, songs as a channel to collectivize the subjects and to prompt them into action that is very utilitarian for the state. And I think the fact that they would label these as healthy is also a way to think about the ideals that they had in mind in constituting a subject that was docile for, state mobilization. So then I think what you're recognizing as, similarity, has something to do with, music being in service of that kind of solidifying of different national subjects. What's ironic about the 1980s, today in my talk I covered 1970s, but come 1980s, the shift occurs in protest culture, and dissidents realize that, this sort of bouts of resistance in these kind of, their expressivity through channeling the dissident, the decadent culture of the West isn't going to serve them well in becoming proponents of, ethnic Korean kind of version of activism. So then, after that shift, they start to actively look for songs that were very native to Korea, looking into folk songs that are not of the Western folk, but Korean folk. And in that way, ironically, they start kind of replicating the very system against which they were trying to resist. So once resistance enters into the mode of mobilization, they start kind of mimicking the state in these very surreal ways. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question for Susan. I think at one point you did mention that the censorship somehow kind of evokes or prime the students into thinking or into looking out for certain types of songs, right? Or a certain way to interpret those songs. Could you tell us more about that?
Thank you for the question. I think the way censorship operated in 1970s was interesting because so much of the censorship was preemptive. So the song, for instance, the song Morning Dew that I talked about today was not really a protest song. He literally, Kim Min-gi, the songwriter, wrote it singing with his friends and decided to actually rip up the score because he wasn't happy with the melody. But it turns, and he was actually not even the first one to record the song officially. He gave it to his friend who is another folk singer in Korea now. And that's how the song got known. Actually, not even through his own voice. It's through another person's voice. And, it became popular because he was singing it at these, in the early 1970s when he was a freshman in college. He was singing it in conjunction, in tandem with numbers like We Shall Overcome, which is the protest song of, the US. But I don't think Kim Min-gi was singing it necessarily in light of the kind of social or political or movement value that the song had. They were very much entranced by things that had flown in from the US, precisely because of its Westernness, precisely because it represented something that was different from the conservative culture in which they were, being fed by the state, the popular music industry at the time. Censorship happened because the state started to notice that, these songs were becoming popular. So the subversiveness of the song doesn't necessarily have to do with any inherent qualities of the song, but then they had to, start putting a label, the state, in order to censor it. And the reasons they cited, among the one I shared today, was something like that the sun rising in the graveyard, the sun is red, rising. It's the rise of North Korea, rise of Kim Il-sung, okay, the founder of North Korea. So they start to, because censorship was happening preemptively in that way, and then getting released as a rationale for the song being, not conducive to national security. It ended up feeding into the imagination of the dissidents in a way that I don't think would have happened if the censorship measure wasn't in place. And in fact, this kind of preemptive measures was not just happening in music, was happening in other realms too, literature and visual arts as well, in film, for one. Yeah.
Great. Well, I would like to invite you all to continue the conversation over wine and snacks just through these double doors. But first, let's give a big thank you to our faculty.